About 2 months ago, under pressure from the West, Ukraine decided to launch a decisive counteroffensive against our positions, which was supposed to show that the Ukrainian armed forces were capable of defeating us. Since then, they have suffered huge losses. I have to say that they have not progressed anywhere. They took somewhere 1, 2, maybe 3 villages, which we have now returned. At the same time, the losses of the Ukrainian armed forces now amount to approximately 700 to 800 people a day. In 2 months they have lost 46,000 servicemen. This is a very huge number, and we see that the counter-offensive of the Ukrainian armed forces now does not give any practical results. They have lost a huge amount of their equipment. The loss of Western equipment is up to 30%. At the same time, what is happening at the front now, I can say that Russian troops in the northern part of the Lugansk region continue to occupy the positions that were previously occupied by Ukrainian troops. That is, the offensive is most likely being conducted there. Unfortunately, with such huge losses, no result occurs, and, in general, we believe that their counter-offensive is almost over. Now Ukraine is in a position where it actually lives on the support of the European Union and the United States in the first place. With regard to the supply of weapons, the longer the pumping of weapons to Ukraine continues, the longer this conflict will last. At the same time, I want to draw attention to the fact that the human resource in Ukraine wears out very quickly. Now almost half of the population remains there, which was around until 2014, when this conflict began, and, in this regard, I am sure that as soon as the supply of weapons from the United States and Europe to Ukraine stops, from that moment the Kiev government will have to end the conflict. Great Britain, together with the United States of America, began to make the so-called anti-Russia out of Ukraine much earlier. It started quite a long time ago, probably until about 2014, when the Maidan Revolution took place in Ukraine. Great Britain began to train and carry out military training of Ukrainian military personnel from the so-called Operation Orbital. Then these trainings and preparations were continued in Great Britain. It plays a major role here among the Europeans. At the same time, of course, the help that comes from Great Britain, it is incomparable with the United States. There are absolutely not the same financial opportunities, but it strives to be the first everywhere in terms of organizing a campaign to continue this pumping of weapons. For example, this was the case with tanks. By the way, it was the first to announce, in order to bring other countries with it, it was the first to announce that it would supply Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine. By the way, they have not actually participated in hostilities anywhere else. I don't even know where they are now, but this negative role of Great Britain, of course, it is reflected in the whole conflict. Here they are what we call the leaders. And in many ways they are the initiators of the continuation of the conflict. London does not consider any peace initiatives and does not want to consider them. Is there a gap in positions between the European Union, Great Britain, the United States? No, now, as we understand it, the European Union almost completely serves the interests of the United States in this policy towards Ukraine, as well as in all other areas. I would say that it is already difficult to draw a line between the activities of NATO and the European Union. They are about the same thing. Both of these organizations have merged with the United States policy of doing as much damage as possible to Russia and tipping the balance of European security in its favor. It must be borne in mind that the Ukrainian economy has suffered greatly as a result of this anti-Russian line. The struggle against the Russians in Ukraine and the struggle with the Russian Federation on the battlefield. The downturn of the economy to date. Wave domestic product is 34%, inflation is 40%. This is a very huge number. The decline in industry is approximately 34%. The decline in industrial production. The decline in agriculture is about 30 to 35%. That is, a third of everything in production is not enough. Currently, half of Ukraine's budget is paid for by external players. The United States and Great Britain, the European Union, Great Britain, and the entire collective West. What is happening with us is quite the opposite. At the beginning of 2022, they predicted a collapse in the economy for us. In fact, it has fallen by 2% in a year. We have decisively rebuilt our economy, although, indeed, the sanctions have affected us. Since Europe was our largest trading partner, we had to reorient trade to the east, to the south. We had to reorient investments, and now I can say that this year we expect our economy to grow by about 1.5 to 2%. This is growth. With a fairly moderate inflation of 5%, this is not much. We have greatly increased domestic investment by 6%, and we are now engaged in the reorientation of investments and the economy through the revival of the industries that we had before. Aircraft building. In recent years, we have completely forgotten what we had under the Soviet Union. Automotive, the same. We are raising new sectors of the economy, and, in general, there is every reason to expect that as a result of these changes in our economy, there will be a rather serious breakthrough in the coming years. The grain deal that we made about a year ago, it consisted of two parts. One part is the so-called Black Sea Initiative, which is the supply of grain from Ukraine. They were supposed to go to Africa, but mostly they went to Europe and other developed countries. The second part of this deal was a memorandum of understanding concluded between Russia and the UN, which provided for a set of conditions that would remove obstacles to the supply of Russian food, grain and fertilizers. These are very important conditions. There were quite a few of them, to be honest. Basically, they consisted in removing obstacles to the charter of ships, to insurance of ships, to a ban on the supply of spare parts for agricultural machinery that operates on the territory of Russia. It was also very important to ensure the normal financial support of these transactions through the SWIFT system for Russian banks. They did absolutely none of this. The UN did not have the opportunity to influence the United States and the European Union, which imposed sanctions. That's why we had every reason to pull out of this deal until our terms were met. By the way, another condition was the supply of fertilizers through the ammonia pipeline from Togliatti to Odessa. The Ukrainian side just blew it up. And that's all. Therefore, nothing could happen here. Nevertheless, over the past few months we have somewhat adapted to the possibilities of exporting Russian grain, and recently there was a deal with Egypt, under which we delivered 300,000 tons of wheat to Egypt at a price that is at the lowest level of market prices, and we will continue these deliveries. Last year we delivered approximately 11 billion tons, of which a lot went to Africa, including, in these first 6 months, we have already delivered 10 billion tons, and we will continue to work with precisely those countries that are in great need of it, mainly in Africa. This is not like that Ukrainian part of the grain deal, when all the grain went to Poland, to Romania, to Bulgaria, to Hungary. And now there is a ban on the supply of this grain. You see, there is a huge imbalance here. Still, we are for a fair solution to this issue. It is not necessary to exaggerate the importance of these components of the Wagner Group against a backdrop of the entire Russian army. In general, it was a commercial project of one person, which received state support at the initial stage. Indeed, this private military company made a significant contribution, for example, during the storming of the city of Artyomovsk, aka Bakhmut. But then, as I understand it, the organizers felt that they were such superhumans and, in general, they decided that they would not be subordinate to the Ministry of Defense, as required by both the law and the Ministry of Defense. They didn't have a big plan. They just wanted to create not a revolution, but a small uprising. Therefore, seriously considering this as a confrontation between the two sides, it does not make sense. This is a small episode in this conflict, which, fortunately, ended almost bloodlessly. Since the investigation is underway, as I understand it, the organizers have been removed from the cases. The soldiers who served in the Wagner Group, they received other assignments. Some of them have joined the Russian armed forces. The other part is doing something else, but this factor, this small episode, our president qualifies as a betrayal. Indeed, when you do such things during the war, it is always very dangerous. However, I think that it is impossible to imagine any repetition of this. The BBC and other Western agencies, the British press, they all look exclusively for the negative in any issue. The World Bank published data on economic growth in Russia. Articles immediately appeared that this was exhaustion, that the Russian economy would again fall into the abyss after that, and so on. Also with PMC Wagner, they don't write to figure things out, they look for the negative in every moment. This has been going on for several years now. I've been here for over 3 years now. And every time I read only the negative, everything that happens here and everything connected with Russia is anointed with black paint. Of course, we appreciate the efforts of all, including the efforts of African states. I know that the representative of Egypt was part of the delegation of African states in Moscow. There is a Chinese initiative. All this is positive. But so far there is no such initiative that would give a realistic way out of this crisis. I see only two ways out of this crisis. If Ukraine continues to be pumped with weapons, and if attacks and hostilities continue from Ukraine, then this will end up with Ukraine becoming a failed state. This is the worst thing, because there will simply be no one to restore it later, and there will be no funds for this, or, indeed, there will be realistic peace talks. We do not know what was now in Jeddah. While we do not have such information, it seems that Zelensky's initiative was discussed there, which is completely unrealistic. It consists roughly in the fact that we must leave all the territories of Ukraine, leave the Russian population to the mercy of fate, since Ukrainian troops will immediately move there, and it will be a bloody massacre. We have to pay huge reparations to Ukraine and hand over our president to some kind of international tribunal. Of course, we will never agree to such agreements. The initiative must be realistic. It should be such that Ukraine would no longer pose a threat to Russia. That is, it must be a neutral, non-nuclear state, as it is actually written in its constitution. In addition, normal conditions for Russia should be provided. And, of course, those territorial realities that exist now must be recognized. We are largely ensuring the demilitarization of Ukraine. We have now destroyed a huge amount of Ukrainian equipment. Now they are fighting with other countries' means, but, for the time being, by their own strength. There can be no compromise here. A referendum was held in these territories. The overwhelming majority of the population in these territories spoke in favor of joining the Russian Federation. Now these territories are enshrined in our constitution. What remains, in fact, is the question of exercising full control over those territories that have become part of the Russian Federation. Actually, this is our business. It is clear that there can be no turning back here. The fact is that now Ukraine is losing on the battlefield in its counteroffensive. This is understandable, and it is largely focused. I dare not say it. On these terrorist attacks against civilian targets in Russia. Yes, indeed. Several drones flew. They did not bring any damage to Moscow or other cities. Indeed. Our settlements near the Ukrainian-Russian border suffered. There are also casualties among the civilian population. It happens. If you deliberately target civilian infrastructure, then this is nothing but terrorism. Russian troops do not strike at civilian infrastructure. They strike exclusively at the military infrastructure of Ukraine. Yes, there is collateral damage. There is no escape. Moreover, Ukraine deploys its air defense systems inside settlements. By the way, this is prohibited by the Hague Conventions. As for the development of the conflict according to such an escalation scenario, it really depends mainly on the increasing supply of weapons from the West. You are right when you say that Russia has to wage war not only with Ukraine, but also to a certain extent with the collective West, basically opposing the supply of these weapons. But there is a fine line here that the West can cross, and this is very dangerous. Therefore, of course, escalation should not be allowed. Should not be allowed the drawing into the Third World War, and the West needs to stop somewhere in its supply of Ukraine, and it needs to take a realistic stance. The strategy that was chosen by the West is wrong. And when London, Washington, Brussels realize that they have made a huge mistake, and it seems to me that this deadline is approaching, then the conversation will be different. Much will depend on the line chosen by the West in regard to arms supplies. We hear many voices that are more and more in agreement with what is happening. According to polls in the United States, there is a growing percentage of people who believe that they should no longer help Ukraine. But I also understand that they cannot leave Ukraine in such a state. It's like a huge ship that was heading in a certain direction. It is now quite difficult to turn it around. I would not like to draw any red lines here. This is not the same conflict. It really turned out to be protracted with the use of huge resources from the West, and there are no clear time parameters. Although many experts predict that around the spring of next year, a new presidential campaign will begin in the United States, and there are many factors that can affect this situation. Even Poland will have elections next autumn, and so on. Therefore, we will monitor how the political situation develops. One thing is now clear: that Ukraine cannot carry out a counteroffensive. On the contrary, we are advancing in some places. Whether this assistance will continue in such a volume or not is a big question. It looks like it won't, and we know that there is some pressure on Ukraine to start the peace talks that it has forbidden itself. We have a conflict with the government, which sits in Kiev, which is pursuing an anti-Russian policy, but we normally treat the people of Ukraine. As far as talk of child abduction is concerned, this is absolutely not true. The fact is that from 5 to 6 million Ukrainian refugees left for Russia. They are there, in Russia, of course. Many families left here with their children. This is natural. We had to evacuate some of the children because they were in orphanages, without parents, and they were close to the front line. Then, this is about 2,000 children. This is 2,500 children. 2,000 of them were returned when it became clear that they were not in danger, that the orphanages located in Donetsk and Lugansk regions were not in danger, but we could not return about 400 children because their orphanages were close to the front line. The shelling continued. So they are really placed with us. Well, where is the crime here? What is the special prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Mr. Karim Khan, talking about? This is complete nonsense.